John Harper was the kind of guy who preferred a quiet life. He wasn't flashy or loud, but he had two things he loved deeply: his cozy little house by the lake and his trusty fishing boat, which he affectionately called Freedom. To John, freedom wasn't just a boat. It was an escape from the stress of everyday life. On weekends, you could always find him out on Lake Serenity, casting his line into the water and letting the gentle waves rock him into a state of calm. It was his happy place. Lake Serenity wasn't just beautiful, it was also central to the community. Families would gather there for picnics, kids splashed around in the shallows, and retirees like John spent hours soaking up its peaceful vibes. But beneath all this tranquility lay something that most people didn't think much about: rules. Rules set by the Homeowners Association, HOA, a group of neighbors tasked with keeping the area looking nice and running smoothly. For years, these rules were no big deal. Things like keeping lawns trimmed and garbage cans out of sight. Most folks followed them without complaint because, honestly, they'd made sense. But then came the letter. One crisp autumn morning, John opened his mailbox to find an envelope marked Urgent Notice from the HOA. His stomach sank as he read through the official-sounding document. Apparently, new regulations had been passed, and one of them specifically targeted boats. According to the HOA, boats parked in driveways or near docks were now considered eyesores and needed to be relocated, or else. The deadline? Just 4 weeks away. And if John didn't comply, they threatened to tow Freedom away. At first, John thought it must be some kind of mistake. How could anyone call his well-maintained boat an eyesore? Freedom wasn't rusty or falling apart. In fact, it was the pride of his weekends, gleaming under the sun whenever he took it out for a spin. Determined to clear things up, John attended the next HOA meeting, hoping to reason with them face to face. Surely, once they saw how important the boat was to him, they'd make an exception. The meeting, however, didn't go as planned. When John raised his hand to speak, he was met with icy stares from the board members, especially Margaret Langley, the HOA president. She listened briefly before cutting him off, explaining that exceptions couldn't be made, not even for someone like John, who had lived in the neighborhood for over a decade. Her tone left no room for negotiation. Rules are rules, she said firmly, as though those 3 words settled everything. Walking back home that evening, John felt a mix of emotions swirling inside him: anger, frustration, and disbelief. He understood why neighborhoods needed guidelines, but this felt different. This felt personal. Why should his joy be taken away because someone decided boats weren't pretty enough? As he stood by the dock staring at Freedom bobbing gently in the water, he realized something. He wasn't ready to give up without a fight. Little did the HOA know, their decision had just sparked something far bigger than they anticipated. Word about John's predicament spread faster than wildfire in the small lakeside community. Neighbors who had barely exchanged hellos before were suddenly talking about nothing else but the HOA's decision to crack down on boats. Some folks sympathized with John, shaking their heads at what they saw as an overreach by the board. "It's not like his boat is ruining anyone's life," muttered Tom, a retired teacher who lived 2 doors down. Others, however, weren't so quick to side with him. They argued that rules existed for a reason: to keep property values high and maintain the neighborhood's pristine appearance. Tensions simmered beneath the surface, and it didn't take long for the divide to become obvious. Anonymous notes began appearing on doorsteps overnight. Some supported John, praising him for standing up against unfair regulations. One note read, "We all love this lake. Why are we letting them take it away piece by piece?" Others were harsher, criticizing John for causing trouble. "If everyone bends the rules, our community will fall apart," one such message warned. The once peaceful neighborhood started feeling more like a battleground. Things came to a head during the next HOA meeting. Normally, these gatherings were dull affairs where people discussed landscaping budgets or holiday decorations. This time, though, the room buzzed with energy. Dozens of residents showed up, packing the chairs and spilling into the hallway. When John stood up to speak, The atmosphere shifted. He spoke calmly but firmly, explaining how much the lake and his boat meant to him. "This isn't just about me," he said, looking around the room. "It's about fairness. You can't tell us we can't use something that belongs to everyone." Margaret Langley, the HOA president, listened with her arms folded across her chest. When it was her turn to respond, she didn't mince words. "Mr. Harper," she began, her voice clipped, "the board has a responsibility to uphold standards. Allowing boats to clutter our docks diminishes the aesthetic value of our community." Her tone implied that the matter was closed, leaving no room for further discussion. But instead of silencing John, her words only fueled his resolve. As he sat back down, murmurs rippled through the crowd. People whispered among themselves, some nodding in agreement with Margaret, while others shot her skeptical looks. After the meeting ended, the parking lot turned into an impromptu debate zone. A group of older residents gathered near John, offering words of encouragement. "You're doing the right thing," said Mary, a soft-spoken woman known for her flower garden. "They think they can push us around because they wear suits, but we're the ones living here." On the other side of the lot, Margaret huddled with a few loyal supporters, defending the board's position. "People need to understand that rules keep order," she insisted, though her confident demeanor seemed slightly shaken. As days passed, the tension grew thicker. Social media groups dedicated to the neighborhood lit up with heated discussions. Photos of freedom circulated online, accompanied by passionate arguments both for and against its presence. Some residents even dug out old pictures of the lake, pointing out how boats had always been part of its charm. Meanwhile, signs began popping up in yards, some reading "Save Our Boats," and others declaring "Respect the Rules." It was clear that John's fight had struck a nerve, turning a personal issue into a community-wide conflict. For John, watching the growing rift was bittersweet. On one hand, he felt grateful for the support pouring in from unexpected corners. On the other hand, he hated seeing his neighbors pitted against each other. Still, he couldn't ignore the fact that many people shared his frustration, not just about boats, but about the HOA's increasing control over their lives. What started as a simple disagreement over a fishing vessel had morphed into something much bigger, a clash between individual freedom and collective authority. And as John stared out at Lake Serenity that evening, he realized the battle was far from over. John Harper wasn't the type to back down from a challenge, but this fight with the HOA felt like an uphill battle. Still, as he sat in his living room staring at the stack of papers on his coffee table, letters from the HOA, notes from neighbors, and countless printouts of local laws, he couldn't shake the feeling that there had to be a way out. He decided to dig deeper, determined to find something, anything, that could help him stand his ground. His first step was reaching out to an old friend named Mike, who happened to be a lawyer. Over coffee one afternoon, John laid out everything. The threats, the meeting with Margaret Langley, and the growing divide among his neighbors. Mike listened intently, nodding along until John finished. Then, with a thoughtful look, Mike said, "You know, I think you might have a point here. Have you looked into whether the HOA actually owns the lake?" That question sparked something in John. He'd always assumed the lake belonged to the neighborhood. It seemed logical since everyone lived around it. But when he started researching state laws, he stumbled upon a surprising truth. Lake Serenity wasn't privately owned. While the HOA controlled the land surrounding the water, the lake itself fell under state jurisdiction, meaning it was technically public property. This revelation hit John like a lightning bolt. If the lake was public, then the HOA's rules about boats didn't hold water, literally or figuratively. Armed with this newfound knowledge, John drafted a plan. It wasn't enough to simply argue his case. He needed to make a statement, something bold that would grab everyone's attention. That's when inspiration struck. What if he turned the tables on the HOA? Instead of waiting for them to serve him notices, why not serve them instead? With Mike's guidance, John created mock eviction notices addressed to the HOA board members. The documents were cleverly worded, accusing the HOA of illegally trying to regulate public waters and demanding they vacate their claim over the lake. Of course, these notices held no legal weight. They were more symbolic than anything. But John knew they would send a powerful message. The idea excited him. But it also made him nervous. Was he going too far? Would people see it as childish or disrespectful? He pushed those doubts aside, reminding himself that sometimes you had to do something unexpected to get people talking. Besides, after weeks of frustration, he was ready to take a stand, not just for himself, but for every neighbor who felt powerless against the HOA's iron grip. On the day he finalized the notices, John couldn't help but smile. He imagined the looks on the board members' faces when they realized they weren't untouchable. For once, they'd experience what it felt like to be on the receiving end of intimidation tactics. As he loaded the printed papers into his truck, John felt a mix of nerves and exhilaration. He knew this move would either rally the community behind him or paint an even bigger target on his back. Either way, he was done playing by their rules. With freedom tied securely to his dock, John prepared for the next phase of his plan. Tomorrow morning, he'd set sail, not just across the calm waters of Lake Serenity, but straight into uncharted territory. His heart raced with anticipation. This wasn't just about saving his boat anymore. It was about proving a point, showing his neighbors that standing up for what's right doesn't mean backing down. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light over the water, John felt something he hadn't felt in weeks. The next morning, John woke up before sunrise, his mind buzzing with excitement and nerves. He slipped on his waders, grabbed a clipboard, and loaded the mock eviction notices into a waterproof bag. As he walked down to the dock, the air was crisp and still, the lake shimmering like glass under the pale light of dawn. Freedom sat quietly in the water, ready for its role in what John hoped would be a turning point. Rowing across the lake felt surreal. The gentle rhythm of the oars slicing through the water gave him time to think about what he was about to do. It wasn't just a prank or some petty act of revenge. It was a statement, a way to show the HOA that their authority wasn't absolute, that they couldn't bully people without consequences. With each stroke, John's confidence grew. By the time he reached the first dock belonging to an HOA board member, he was smiling. The first stop was Margaret Langley's property. Her sprawling house loomed over the lake, its manicured lawn practically screaming perfection. John tied Freedom to her dock and climbed onto the wooden planks, holding the clipboard tightly in one hand and the notice in the other. Carefully, he taped the document to the post near her boat's slip, making sure it was visible from the shore. Then, standing tall, he rang her doorbell twice before calling out loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. "You've been served." He didn't stick around to see her reaction. Instead, he hopped back into his boat and rowed toward the next target. Each delivery followed the same pattern. Tape the notice, ring the bell, and announce his arrival. Some homes were quiet, their owners likely still asleep, while others had curious neighbors peeking through windows. At one house, a man opened the door in his bathrobe, looking confused as John cheerfully declared, "Good morning. Just serving your official notice." The man blinked, unsure whether to laugh or call the cops. Word spread quickly. Phones buzzed with texts and calls as residents spotted John making his rounds. Kids who had been eating breakfast rushed outside to watch, giggling at the spectacle. Parents snapped photos and videos, many of which ended up online within minutes. Social media exploded with reactions, ranging from cheers of support to disbelief at how far John was willing to go. One video, showing him theatrically taping a notice to a dock while tipping an imaginary hat, went viral almost instantly. Commenters dubbed him the Lake Liberator, praising his creativity and courage. Back at the HOA office, Margaret Langley was fuming. She'd gotten a phone call from another board member alerting her to John's antics, and by the time she arrived home, a small crowd had gathered near her dock. Cameras flashed as reporters showed up, eager to cover the unfolding drama. Margaret tried to ignore them, storming past with clenched fists and muttering about harassment under her breath. But the damage was done. Her stern, unyielding image now seemed ridiculous compared to John's lighthearted rebellion. By noon, John had completed his mission. Every HOA board member had received their notice, and the entire neighborhood was talking about it. People who had previously stayed silent began speaking up, sharing stories of their own frustrations with the HOA. Even those who hadn't supported John initially found themselves chuckling at the absurdity of the situation. For the first time in weeks, the atmosphere around Lake Serenity felt alive. Not tense or divided, but united in laughter and defiance. As John rowed back to his dock, exhausted but exhilarated, he noticed something surprising. Several neighbors stood along the shoreline, clapping and whistling. Someone even shouted, "Way to go, John." He waved back, feeling a surge of gratitude. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about all of them taking a stand together. And though he knew the HOA wouldn't take this lying down, he also knew one thing for certain. The tide was finally turning. The fallout from John's mock eviction notices was immediate and explosive. By the end of the day, local news stations had picked up the story, turning what started as a neighborhood dispute into a full-blown media sensation. Reporters flocked to Lake Serenity, setting up cameras on docks and interviewing anyone who would talk. Neighbors lined up to share their opinions, some praising John's boldness, others criticizing his methods. The phrase "Lake Liberator" became a household name overnight, splashed across headlines and trending online. For the HOA, the attention was nothing short of disastrous. Margaret Langley, once seen as a no-nonsense leader, now appeared out of touch and petty. Footage of her storming past reporters played on repeat during evening broadcasts, her scowl becoming meme-worthy material. Meanwhile, John Harper was portrayed as the underdog hero, a regular guy standing up to an overbearing bureaucracy. People loved it. Social media lit up with hashtags like #SaveYourLake and #FreedomFloats, drawing support not just locally but from across the country. Strangers sent messages of encouragement, while others shared similar stories of battles with their own HOAs. But the HOA wasn't about to let this slide without a fight. Within days, they retaliated by slapping John with a slew of fines for supposed violations, everything from improper boat storage to disruptive behavior. They even filed a lawsuit, accusing him of harassment and defamation. To many, it seemed like overkill, further damaging the HOA's reputation. Critics pointed out that instead of addressing the root issue, the board was doubling down on tactics that only made them look worse. The community, however, rallied behind John. Inspired by his actions, dozens of residents joined forces to protest the HOA's policies. Signs popped up all over the neighborhood. "Boats belong here," "Public water," "Public rights," and even playful ones like "Honk if you love freedom." Petitions circulated online and offline, demanding reforms and greater transparency from the board. At one point, nearly 100 people gathered near the lake for a peaceful demonstration, chanting slogans and cheering whenever John spoke. It was clear that his act of defiance had struck a chord, uniting neighbors who had long felt powerless against the HOA's rigid rules. Internally, the HOA began to fracture. Some board members privately admitted that the backlash had gone too far and urged Margaret to reconsider their stance. Others resigned outright, unwilling to face the growing criticism. Margaret herself struggled to maintain control, her usual confidence shaken by the avalanche of negative attention. She called emergency meetings, trying to strategize a response, but every move seemed to dig the hole deeper. Even longtime supporters began questioning whether the board's priorities aligned with those of the community. As tensions escalated, so did the legal battle. Both sides prepared for court, each determined to prove their case. For John, it meant countless hours meeting with lawyers, gathering evidence, and preparing arguments. While he remained hopeful, the stress weighed heavily on him. He missed his quiet weekends on the water, replaced now by late-night strategy sessions and endless phone calls. Still, he refused to back down. Every time doubt crept in, he reminded himself why he'd started this fight, not just for his boat, but for everyone who deserved a voice. Despite the chaos, there were moments of triumph. One afternoon, as John walked along the shore, a young boy approached him holding a handmade sign that read, "Thank you, Mr. Harper." His mother stood nearby, smiling. "We've lived here for years, scared to say anything," she said. "You gave us courage." Moments like these kept John going, fueling his determination to see the fight through. Though the road ahead was uncertain, one thing was clear. John's small act of rebellion had ignited something much bigger, a movement. What began as a personal struggle had transformed into a community-wide stand against authority gone awry. And while the outcome remained to be seen, the spirit of Lake Serenity and its people felt stronger than ever. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation on the day of the trial. Reporters squeezed into every available seat, their cameras ready to capture the drama. Residents packed the benches too, some wearing buttons that read, "Save Our Lake," while others sat quietly, unsure whose side they truly supported. John Harper stood at the center of it all, dressed in his best suit, but looking understandably nervous. This wasn't just a legal battle, it was a test of whether one man's courage could challenge an entire system. The hearing began with the HOA presenting its case. Margaret Langley took the stand first, her voice steady as she explained how John's actions had disrupted the community and violated HOA rules. She described the mock eviction notices as harassment and argued that John's defiance undermined the board's authority. Her tone was calm, almost rehearsed, but there were cracks beneath the surface, moments when she hesitated or glanced toward the crowd, perhaps sensing the skepticism in the room. When asked why the HOA claimed control over the lake, her answers grew vague, relying heavily on phrases like aesthetic standards and community values. John's lawyer, Mike, listened intently, jotting notes as he prepared for his turn. When it was finally time to present their side, Mike wasted no time cutting to the heart of the matter. He walked up to the judge, holding up a map of Lake Serenity. "Your Honor," he began, pointing to the water, "this lake is public property. The state owns it, not the HOA. They can regulate the land around it, yes, but not the water itself. Their attempt to do so is not only baseless but illegal." Mike then turned to address the HOA's claims about John's behavior. "My client's actions may have been unconventional, but they were never malicious. These notices weren't meant to harm anyone. They were a statement, a way to highlight the absurdity of the situation. If anything, they've sparked important conversations about fairness and transparency within this community." Witnesses were called next. Neighbors testified about how the HOA's rules had affected them, sharing stories of frustration and powerlessness. One woman recounted being fined for planting flowers that didn't match the approved color palette. Another spoke about feeling bullied by the board after questioning their decisions. Each story added weight to John's argument, painting the HOA as out of touch and overly controlling. When it was John's turn to speak, the room fell silent. Standing before the judge, he spoke plainly but passionately. "I love my boat because it represents freedom. The freedom to enjoy something we all share, this beautiful lake. I didn't start this fight to cause trouble. I started it because I believe in fairness. The HOA has good intentions, but their rules have gone too far. We're not asking for chaos. We're asking for balance." The judge listened carefully, occasionally nodding as both sides made their points. After hours of testimony, closing arguments, and deliberation, the verdict came down. John had won. The judge ruled that the HOA's claims against him were unfounded and reaffirmed the public's right to use Lake Serenity without interference. While the decision didn't dismantle the HOA entirely, it set a precedent that limited their reach, particularly regarding the lake. Outside the courthouse, cheers erupted as news of the ruling spread. Neighbors hugged each other, celebrating not just John's victory, but the hope it brought for change. Cameras flashed as reporters surrounded John, eager to hear his reaction. Smiling tiredly, he said simply, "This isn't just my win. It's ours. Let's keep working together to make this community better." But despite the celebration, John knew the fight had taken its toll. Friendships had been strained, tempers flared, and trust between neighbors would take time to rebuild. Still, there was a sense of relief in knowing that progress had been made. As he drove home that evening, the sun setting behind the trees, John allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. The road ahead wouldn't always be smooth, but for now, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Sometimes, standing your ground, even when it feels impossible, is worth it. In the weeks following the court ruling, a noticeable change swept through the neighborhood. The HOA, once an unshakable force, began to transform. Margaret Langley quietly stepped down as president, citing personal reasons, though everyone knew better. A new leadership team emerged, composed of residents who promised transparency and fairness. They held open meetings where neighbors could voice their concerns without fear of judgment or retaliation. Rules that had long been sources of frustration, like the ones dictating flower colors or boat storage, were reviewed and revised. For the first time in years, the community felt like it belonged to the people living there, not just the board. John returned to his quiet life, relieved to have the chaos behind him. He still took freedom out on the lake every weekend, but now he noticed something different. Instead of avoiding eye contact or rushing past, neighbors stopped to chat. Some even joined him for fishing trips, bringing their kids along to teach them how to cast a line. One Saturday morning, Mary, the woman known for her flower garden, showed up at his dock with a thermos of coffee and homemade muffins. "You deserve this," she said with a warm smile. "And so does freedom." It was a small gesture, but it meant the world to John. The lake itself seemed to reflect the shift in the community. Gone were the tense silences and guarded glances. Families gathered again for picnics by the shore, laughter echoing across the water. Even the docks, once battlegrounds of conflicting opinions, became places of connection. People started sharing tools, offering tips on boat maintenance, and organizing cleanup days to keep the lake pristine. The Save Our Lake signs that had dotted lawns during the protest were replaced with new ones. "Welcome to Lake Serenity." Still, John remained cautious. He understood that while the immediate battle was won, vigilance was key. Power unchecked often leads to abuse, and he didn't want to see history repeat itself. So when the new HOA board invited him to join as an advisor, he accepted, not because he wanted power, but because he believed in safeguarding the balance between rules and freedom. His role was simple: to remind the board that their decisions should always prioritize the well-being of the community over arbitrary standards. As months passed, John found joy in the little things again. The gentle rocking of freedom on calm waters, the sound of birds chirping at sunrise, the friendly waves from passing boaters. But what brought him the most satisfaction was seeing his neighbors stand taller, more confident in their ability to make a difference. The rebellion he'd sparked wasn't just about boats or lakes. It was about reminding everyone that they had a voice, and that collective action could create real change. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, John sat on his dock with a cup of tea. Freedom bobbed gently beside him, its name gleaming in the fading light. He thought about everything that had happened: the stress, the victories, the friendships forged, and realized something profound. Sometimes, standing up for what you love doesn't just protect it, it strengthens it. Lake Serenity wasn't just a body of water anymore. It was a symbol of unity, resilience, and hope. And John Harper, the man who had dared to challenge authority, had helped turn it into exactly what its name promised: a place of peace. As he sipped his tea and listened to the lapping waves, he smiled, knowing he'd played a part in making that happen. Life wasn't perfect, but it was good. And for now, that was enough.